She won't last the winter. The Duke scoffed his eyes, raking over her trembling frame, but beneath her porcelain skin beat the heart of a survivor. While his men bled trying to break his monstrous war stallion, this frail girl was about to bring the untamable beast and the Duke himself to his knees. The year was 1815, and the biting autumn winds of Yorkshire howled across the moors, mercilessly battering the grand stone facade of the Ashdown estate. Inside the rattling carriage that crawled up the winding gravel drive sat Lady Cecilia Linfield. She was a picture of devastating fragility, clutching a heavy wool shawl around her trembling shoulders. A horrific bout of typhoid had swept through London months prior, claiming her father and leaving her a destitute orphan. It had also stripped Cecilia of her vitality, reducing her to a hollow-cheeked spectre, with lungs that rattled with every drawn breath. Her legal guardianship had fallen to a distant cousin by marriage, Nathaniel Ashdown, the Duke of Westmoreland. Known throughout the peerage as the Iron Duke of the North, Nathaniel was a man forged in the brutal fires of the Peninsular War and the blood-soaked fields of Waterloo. He had returned to England with an impressive array of medals, a jagged sabre scar down his left jaw, and a heart as unyielding as the granite of his ancestral home. When the carriage finally lurched to a halt in the courtyard, the rain was coming down in icy sheets. The carriage door was wrenched open, not by a footman, but by the Duke himself. Nathaniel stood towering in the downpour, a dark riding cloak whipping around his broad shoulders. He did not offer his hand. Instead, his piercing grey eyes swept over Cecilia's skeletal frame as she struggled to descend the steps, her breath hitching into a painful rattling cough. "Good God," Nathaniel muttered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the sound of the rain. "They sent me a corpse." Cecilia's jaw tightened. She swayed as her boots hit the muddy cobblestones, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I assure you, Your Grace, I am quite alive." Nathaniel scoffed, turning on his heel to address his towering head groom Thomas. "Get her inside before the damp finishes what the London fever started. Send for Doctor Harrison immediately, though I doubt he can do much. Look at her, Thomas. She is too frail to survive here. Yorkshire winters do not suffer the weak." He spoke about her as if she were a defective piece of property, deaf to the carriage and blind to the insult. Cecilia bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. She had spent her entire life being underestimated, first by a society that valued boisterous, robust women, and now by a battle-hardened duke who viewed physical weakness as a moral failing. But as Cecilia was led toward the heavy oak doors of the manor, a terrifying sound shattered the gloom of the estate. It was a high, shrieking neigh, followed by the deafening crack of splintering wood. From the stone stables across the courtyard, a massive beast erupted into the rain. It was a war stallion of nightmarish proportions, a pure black Andalusian crossbreed, standing a staggering 17 hands high. His coat was slick with rain and sweat, his eyes rolling wildly, showing the whites in sheer panic. Two burly stable hands were dragged through the mud like rag dolls as they clung desperately to the heavy lead ropes attached to the beast's halter. "Hold him! Hold the bastard!" Thomas roared, sprinting toward the chaos. The horse reared its massive iron-shod hooves, slicing through the air just inches from a groom's skull. The man screamed and let go, scrambling backward into the muck. Cecilia froze on the manor steps, her heart hammering against her fragile ribs. She watched as Nathaniel did not flinch, nor did he run for cover. He strode directly toward the raging animal, his face a mask of furious determination. "Goliath, yield!" Nathaniel bellowed, his voice echoing with the authority of a battlefield commander. But Goliath was not a soldier. He was a traumatized animal. The stallion snapped its jaws, missing the Duke's shoulder by a fraction of an inch, before lunging sideways and slamming a hind leg into the stone wall. The impact sounded like a gunshot. The remaining groom dropped the rope, terrified, and the stallion bolted blindly into the enclosed paddock, pacing the fence line with frantic, aggressive energy, his chest heaving and foam flying from his lips. "He's mad, Your Grace," Thomas panted, wiping mud and blood from his face. "That beast is stark, raving mad. He nearly crushed poor Jenkins against the stall this morning. You must let me fetch the rifle. It's a mercy." Nathaniel's jaw clenched the scar on his cheek, pulling taut. He stared at the pacing stallion, a flicker of something unreadable perhaps, recognition, perhaps sorrow crossing his steely gaze. "No," the Duke commanded sharply. "He saved my life at Quatre Bras. I will not repay him with a bullet. Starve him for a day, if you must break him with the heavy tackle, but you will not shoot him. Am I understood? But Your Grace. Am I understood, Thomas?" "Yes, Your Grace." Cecilia watched from the threshold of the manor. She saw the violent trembling in the horse's flanks. She saw the way the animal kept its left side pressed away from the men, guarding a jagged healed scar on its left shoulder. And in that chaotic, rain-swept courtyard, the fragile girl realized something the battle-hardened men had entirely missed. The horse wasn't mad. It was terrified. The first month at Ashdown Estate was an exercise in isolation for Cecilia. The Duke was rarely seen in the manor, spending his days managing his vast tenant farms, or shut away in his study with decanters of brandy, fighting the ghosts of his past. Dr. Harrison had prescribed Cecilia strict bed rest, a vile tonic of laudanum and heavy meals she could barely stomach. Yet as the weeks bled into November, Cecilia felt the faintest stirrings of strength returning to her limbs. The crisp Yorkshire air, though brutally cold, felt cleaner in her damaged lungs than the smog of London. When the manor slept, she would quietly slip from her chambers, wrapping herself in a heavy velvet cloak, and wander the estate. Her steps invariably led her to the stables. She had watched the grooms try to break Goliath over the past weeks. Their methods were harsh, born of fear and impatience. They used long whips that cracked like musket fire, heavy chains that rattled, and loud, aggressive shouts. Every attempt ended in disaster. Goliath would turn into a whirlwind of teeth and hooves, severely injuring another stable hand and completely destroying two heavy oak stalls. Whispers swept through the estate staff that the beast was a demon, a curse brought back from the French slaughter. Late one night, under the pale illumination of a full moon, Cecilia walked quietly into the stables. The air was thick with the smell of sweet hay leather and the pungent sweat of horses. The other mounts nickered softly as she passed, but from the reinforced isolation stall at the very end of the corridor, there was only a heavy, rhythmic breathing. Cecilia approached the iron-barred door of Goliath's stall. The massive black stallion was huddled in the far corner, his head lowered, facing the wall. She did not carry a lantern, knowing the sudden light would startle him. She did not speak. She simply stood by the bars, leaning her fragile weight against the cold iron, and began to hum. It was an old French lullaby her mother had sung to her, a soft, melancholy melody that barely rose above a whisper. At the sound, Goliath's ears pinned flat against his skull. He spun around his hooves, kicking up a cloud of sawdust. His nostrils flared, ready to fight the new threat. Cecilia did not move. She didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't step back. She remained perfectly still, a tiny, frail silhouette against the moonlight streaming through the stable window. She kept humming, keeping her hands visible and relaxed by her sides. For 10 agonizing minutes, the massive warhorse paced the back of the stall, tossing his heavy head, waiting for the crack of a whip or the shout of a man. When neither came, his pacing slowed. The whites of his eyes receded slightly. "You're fighting a war that's already over, aren't you, my brave boy?" Cecilia whispered softly. Her voice was weak, raspy from her illness, but it carried a profound, gentle resonance. She had noticed his left eye was clouded. The saber slash on his shoulder had likely damaged his vision on that side. The grooms always approached him from the left, traditional for horsemanship, but for Goliath, it meant a terrifying blind spot where danger always struck first. Slowly, deliberately, Cecilia reached into her cloak and pulled out a bruised, sweet autumn apple. She slid her pale hand between the iron bars, keeping it perfectly steady. Goliath snorted a massive gust of air that ruffled Cecilia's hair. He took a hesitant step forward. The sheer size of the beast was overwhelming. He could snap her arm with a single bite. Her heart fluttered like a trapped bird against her ribs, but her hand remained a pillar of stone. The horse stretched his neck out, his velvet muzzle hovering inches from her palm. He inhaled her scent lavender medicine, and something entirely devoid of fear. Gently, with surprising delicacy, his lips brushed her skin. And he took the apple. Over the next 2 weeks, this became their secret ritual. While Nathaniel hosted loud, drunken dinners with fellow veterans to drown out his memories, Cecilia was in the quiet dark, healing a broken soldier of a different kind. One evening, Nathaniel was entertaining Lord Henry Fitzroy, a former cavalry captain. The sounds of clinking crystal and loud arguments drifted from the dining hall. "You must put the beast down, Ashdown," Lord Henry insisted, slamming his wine glass onto the mahogany table. "It's madness to keep him. He shattered the collarbone of your best rider yesterday. He's a liability. Waterloo broke his mind just as surely as it broke." Henry cut himself off, realizing he was treading dangerous ground. Nathaniel stared into his amber brandy, his jaw muscles clenching. "He carried me through the mud of Hougoumont when my own leg was bleeding out. I owe him his life." "You are keeping him alive out of misplaced guilt," Henry argued. "Give the order. Have Thomas end it quickly. If you don't, that horse will kill someone, and their blood will be on your hands." The words struck Nathaniel like a physical blow. The crushing weight of command, the guilt of the men he had lost, the inability to save those who fought for him, it was suffocating. He abruptly stood his chair, scraping violently against the floorboards. "I need some air." Without waiting for his guest, the Duke stormed out of the manor, his boots crunching angrily against the frost-covered gravel. He didn't know why, but his feet carried him toward the stables. Perhaps Henry was right. Perhaps it was time to end the misery. Nathaniel pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the stable. The familiar scent of hay and horses greeted him, but something was terribly wrong. The heavy iron bolt on Goliath's isolation stall was slid back. The door was ajar. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Nathaniel's chest. The grooms knew better than to leave the door unlatched. If the beast was loose, he sprinted silently down the corridor, rounding the corner to the Stallion's stall, preparing himself for a scene of bloody carnage. But as he reached the threshold, the breath left his lungs. He froze, paralyzed by a sight that defied all logic. There in the center of the stall stood the monstrous black war stallion, and standing right beside his massive chest, looking impossibly small, was Lady Cecilia Linfield. She had no halter, no ropes, no whip. She was wearing a simple white nightgown and a dark cloak, her pale, fragile hands resting gently against the terrifying beast's uninjured right shoulder. Goliath's massive head was lowered, his eyes soft and half closed, his nose resting peacefully against the crown of Cecilia's hair. Nathaniel's boot scraped against the stone floor. At the sudden sound, Goliath's head snapped up. His ears pinned back, and a deep, rumbling warning growled in his chest. He shifted his massive bulk, stepping in front of Cecilia, shielding her from the Duke, his eyes locking onto Nathaniel with murderous intent. Cecilia calmly raised her hand and placed it flat against the horse's neck. Easy, Goliath. Hush now, she murmured. Instantly the horse's muscles uncoiled. He snorted, gave Nathaniel one last warning glare, and then lowered his head back down to Cecilia's shoulder, seeking her touch. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, utterly speechless. The Iron Duke, who had stared down the cannons of Napoleon without blinking, was entirely undone by the sight of a frail, sickly girl who had achieved in weeks what his strongest men couldn't do in months. How? Nathaniel whispered, the word barely escaping his lips. Cecilia turned her head to look at him. Her face was still pale, her frame still frighteningly thin, but her eyes held the fierce, undeniable fire of an equal. "Because, Your Grace," she replied quietly, her voice echoing in the still stable, "I do not punish him for his scars, and I do not mistake his terror for madness." The morning after the incident in the stables, the atmosphere at Ashdown Estate shifted fundamentally. Nathaniel no longer looked at Cecilia as a fragile burden to be kept out of drafts. He watched her with a mixture of intense curiosity and quiet awe. He ordered the stable hands to completely cease their brutal training methods. From that day forward, only Lady Cecilia was permitted to work with Goliath. Cecilia's approach was deeply unconventional for the era. During her father's life in London, she had corresponded with Bracy Clark, a renowned and controversial veterinary surgeon, who championed the compassionate treatment of horses and heavily criticized the harsh bitting practices of the cavalry. Drawing upon Clark's medical journals, Cecilia instituted a new regimen for the traumatized stallion. She nailed a strict set of rules to the stable door, demanding compliance from every man on the estate. Always approach from the right. Never blindside his scarred, vision-impaired left flank. No raised voices or sudden movements. Startling noises trigger his battlefield instincts. Steady hands, steady heart. The animal will instantly mirror human fear or aggression. For weeks, Nathaniel stood in the shadows of the paddock, watching as the sickly girl performed miracles. Cecilia discarded the heavy, iron-shanked cavalry bit that tore at Goliath's mouth. Instead, she fashioned a simple, padded leather halter. She did not force the horse to run. She walked with him. When her lungs ached and her breath rattled, she would lean against his massive black shoulder, and the war stallion would stand perfectly still, anchoring her until the coughing fits passed. In healing the beast, Cecilia was healing herself. The color returned to her porcelain cheeks, and the haunted, hollow look in her eyes was replaced by a fierce, undeniable spark. Nathaniel, too, found his own demons quieting. The brandy decanters in his study gathered dust. He found himself drawn to the stables, learning from Cecilia how to speak softly, how to move without aggression, and how to forgive himself for the blood on his hands. A profound, unspoken bond began to weave between the battle-hardened Duke and the resolute lady. However, the tranquility of their sanctuary was shattered just weeks before Christmas. Lord Henry Fitzroy returned to Ashdown Estate, accompanied by a retinue of wealthy, arrogant peers, eager for the annual winter solstice hunt. Henry, still nursing a bruised ego from Nathaniel's previous dismissal, was horrified to see Goliath out in the open pastures. "You are playing a fool's game." Ashdown, Henry sneered over dinner, his eyes darting towards Cecilia, who sat quietly at the end of the mahogany table. "I hear you've let a frail, consumptive girl play nursemaid to a killer. That beast belongs at the knacker's yard." Nathaniel's knuckles turned white as he gripped his wine glass. "Lady Cecilia has achieved more with Goliath in 2 months than my finest cavalrymen did in a year. You will speak of her and the horse with respect." Henry laughed a cruel, sharp sound. "Respect for a parlor trick, I wager the beast is still as feral as a cornered wolf. In fact, I will put 1,000 guineas on it." Henry slammed his hand on the table, silencing the room. If the girl is so confident in her methods, let her ride him at the solstice hunt tomorrow. If she can keep her seat and guide that monster through the chaos of the hounds without him killing someone, I will pay the sum and publicly apologize. But if he breaks rank rears or attacks, you will hand me your pistol, Nathaniel, and I will put a bullet between the beast's eyes myself." "Absolutely not," Nathaniel roared, standing so violently his chair tipped backward. "I will not risk Cecilia's life for your arrogant amusement. I accept the wager." The soft, clear voice cut through the dining hall like a silver blade. All eyes turned to Cecilia. She was on her feet, her posture as straight as a soldier's. "Cecilia, no," Nathaniel warned, striding toward her. "The noise, the horns, the pack of hounds, it is a mock battlefield. It will trigger every terror the horse has." "He trusts me, your grace," Cecilia said, meeting Nathaniel's stormy grey eyes. "And I trust him. If we do not prove his sanity tomorrow, Lord Henry and his ilk will never let this rest. They will always demand his blood." She turned her gaze to Henry, her expression turning to ice. 1,000 guineas, Lord Henry. Ensure your purse is heavy tomorrow. I intend to collect. The morning of the solstice hunt dawned bitterly cold, the Yorkshire moors blanketed in a thick, glittering frost. Dozens of aristocrats clad in vibrant red riding coats gathered in the courtyard of Ashdown Estate. The air was electric with gossip and tension. The hounds whined and barked, straining against their leashes, while the brass hunting horns gleamed in the pale winter sun. When Cecilia emerged from the stables, a hush fell over the crowd. She was mounted on Goliath. The stallion looked magnificent, his black coat brushed to a high gloss, his massive muscles rippling beneath the frost. He dwarfed every other horse in the courtyard. Cecilia sat side-saddle, wearing a tailored navy blue riding habit. She looked impossibly fragile atop the 17-hand monster, yet she held the reins with a relaxed, confident grace. Goliath's ears twitched nervously at the sound of the hounds, but Cecilia stroked his neck, murmuring softly to him, keeping his attention anchored to her. Nathaniel rode up beside her on his grey gelding. His face was pale with worry. "You do not have to do this, Cecilia. Say the word and I will send Henry packing." "We are ready, Nathaniel." She smiled gently. It was the first time she had used his Christian name. His heart skipped a painful, thrilling beat. Lord Henry sneered from atop his chestnut mare. "Let the hunt begin!" he shouted. The master of hounds blew the brass horn, a sharp, piercing blast that shattered the morning quiet. The dogs howled and surged forward. The aristocrats kicked their horses into a gallop, the thundering of hooves echoing like cannon fire. Goliath's head snapped up. His nostrils flared, pulling in the scent of crushed frost and sweat. The chaotic noise hit him like a physical blow. He let out a distressed whinny, his hindquarters dropping as he prepared to rear and fight the invisible enemy. "Steady, my brave boy," Cecilia commanded, her voice cutting through his panic. She shifted her weight deliberately, loosening her grip on the reins rather than tightening them. She leaned forward, pressing her cheek against his uninjured right shoulder. "I am here. You are safe. Run with me." Goliath hesitated. The instincts of the battlefield screamed at him to fight, but the gentle pressure of the woman on his back anchored him to the present. He let out a massive snort, shaking his head, and then he surged forward. He did not bolt in terror. He ran with purpose. The war stallion's stride was massive, devouring the frost-covered moors. Within minutes, Cecilia and Goliath had overtaken the main party. The sheer power beneath her was intoxicating. The wind whipped her hair and brought a fierce, flushed color to her cheeks. She felt no weakness in her lungs, only the exhilarating rush of freedom. Lord Henry watched in furious disbelief as the frail orphan and the mad horse navigated the treacherous terrain with flawless, breathtaking precision. Desperate to win the wager and preserve his pride, Henry spurred his horse, cutting dangerously close to Goliath's blind left side. As he approached, Henry covertly uncoiled his heavy leather riding crop and cracked it violently against his own boot, a sound identical to a musket shot. Goliath shrieked. The phantom gunshot in his blind spot was too much. The massive stallion locked his front knees and reared violently, his front hooves pawing at the winter sky. The crowd gasped. Several women screamed. But Cecilia did not fall. She possessed no physical strength to muscle the beast down. Instead, she yielded. She threw her arms wrapped tightly around Goliath's thick neck, pressing herself entirely against him, becoming one with his center of gravity. Goliath down! She screamed, not with fear, but with absolute, unwavering authority. The stallion hung in the air for a terrible second. Then, feeling her secure weight and hearing her voice over the ringing in his ears, he crashed his front hooves back onto the frozen earth. He stood, trembling, completely lathered in sweat, but he did not bolt. He stayed perfectly still, waiting for her command. Nathaniel spurred his grey gelding forward, cutting off Lord Henry's horse with such violence that Henry was nearly unseated. The Duke's eyes were blazing with a murderous, terrifying rage. "If you ever raise a whip near her or that horse again—" Nathaniel snarled his hand, resting ominously on the hilt of his riding blade. "I will not challenge you to a duel, Henry. I will simply bury you on the moor. You owe Lady Cecilia 1,000 guineas. Henry, pale and trembling under the Iron Duke's wrath, spurred his horse and fled back toward the manor. The rest of the hunting party erupted into spontaneous applause. The beast was not a killer. He was a disciplined soldier, tamed not by the whip but by the extraordinary empathy of a woman society had deemed too frail to survive. Nathaniel dismounted and rushed to Cecilia's side. He reached up, grasping her waist, and gently lifted her down from the massive stallion. Her legs were trembling from the exertion, and she swayed slightly as her boots hit the ground. Instantly, Nathaniel's strong arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against his chest. Goliath lowered his massive head, affectionately nudging Nathaniel in the back, effectively pushing the Duke closer to Cecilia. "You foolish, brave, impossible woman." Nathaniel breathed, his forehead resting against hers. His hands traced the contours of her face, marveling at the vibrant life coursing through her. When he reared, I thought my heart had stopped. Cecilia looked up into his stormy grey eyes, no longer seeing the cold, unyielding Iron Duke, but a man who had finally learned to let his armor fall. "I told you, Your Grace. I trust him. Just as I trust you." "Sure." "Then trust me when I say this," Nathaniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled back slightly, his gaze dropping to her lips. "You did not just tame the wildest war stallion in Yorkshire, Cecilia. You tamed the ghosts in this estate, and you have entirely conquered me." Under the pale winter sun, surrounded by the frost-kissed moors, Nathaniel leaned down and kissed her. It was not a tentative gesture, but a profound sealing of a partnership forged in survival understanding and unyielding strength. The girl they said would not survive the winter had not merely survived. She had become the undisputed queen of Ashdown Estate and the master of the Iron Duke's heart. Did Cecilia's incredible courage and Goliath's fierce loyalty capture your heart? If you loved this story of a fragile but unbreakable woman taming the beast and the Duke, please hit that like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss another thrilling historical romance and true-to-life drama. Drop a comment below. Would you have dared to ride the war stallion